2012年5月20日、自立生活センター札幌15周年記念イベント、ジュディ・ヒューマンさんを招いての講演会を開催しました。自らの障害をパワーに変え、地域や国、世界を変えてきたジュディさん自身が経験してきた自立生活運動と、その運動の中でジュディさんを変えたのは何か、彼女が目指す社会とは何か、今の思いを語っていただきます。
皆さん、こんにちは。今日はお忙しい中、たくさんの方々にお集まりいただきまして、本当にどうもありがとうございます。ジュディさんとは2002年にですね、北海道の DPI 国際会議でですね、初めてお会いすることができました。その時にですね、ジュディさんとちょっとだけご挨拶をしたんですけれども、なんてパワフルで、なんてエネルギッシュで素敵な女性なんだろうと思って、でそれからずっとですね、10年間ぜひジュディさんに日本に来ていただいて、いつか講演会を開きたい、ジュディさんのお話を聞いてみたいという思いをですね、この10年間捧げてまいりました。それが今回実現のすることになりまして、本当に嬉しく夢のように思っています。私も、自立生活を始め、地域で生きるようになって22年を迎えることになりました。22年間の自立生活、本当に22年前はですね、まだ呼吸器をつけて地域で暮らす方などはいない時代だったので、あの時は崖から飛び降りるような気持ちでですね、3日でいいから死んでもいいから自分らしく生きたと言えるようなですね、時間を持ちたいという思いでですね、自立生活を始めました。それがもう22年も経ち、本当に振り返るとひたすら突っ走ってきたような22年間だったんですけれども、今ここでまた改めてですね、この22年間の自分の人生を振り返って、そして今一度ここでまた明日から前を向いて歩いていくためにですね、ジュディさんのパワーをもらうことができたらなと思って講演を開催することになりました。講演を開催するにあたってですね、日本を代表する、自立生活運動をされているリーダーの、素敵な女性の方たちがですね、今日は応援に駆けつけてくださっています。後で皆さんと一緒にパネルディスカッションをすることになっています。今日は5時までというちょっと長い時間になりますが、皆さんもぜひ最後まで、お付き合いいただければ大変嬉しく思います。本当に今日はどうもありがとうございました。
ジュディ・ヒューマンさんは障害分野における世界的リーダーであり、社会的弱者の人権を守るための活動をライフワークとされています。これまで30年以上にわたって世界中の障害者団体と連携し、障害者運動の第一線で活躍してきました。1975年にカリフォルニア州バークレーの自立生活センターの共同設立者であると同時に、同州オークランドの世界障害研究所の立ち上げにも携わりました。1993年から2001年にはクリントン政権下の教育省の次官として同省の特別支援教育とリハビリテーションを担当、特別支援養育プログラムに関する法整備をはじめ、障害分野の研究や職業訓練、自立生活などに注力し、 800万人とも言われるアメリカ合衆国の障害者のために尽力しました。2002年から2006年には世界銀行において障害と開発に関する初代顧問を務めます。それにより世界銀行の障害に関する事業は拡大し、クライアント各国との議論や分析作業に障害という軸が組み込まれるようになりました。現在は障害者権利擁護の専門家として米国国務省特別顧問を務められております。それではジュディ・ヒューマンさん、よろしくお願いいたします。テーマは世界を変えた、私を変えた自立生活運動です。よろしくお願いいたします。
Arigato. It's really a privilege for me to be able to be with you today. And I need to start off by saying I am really no different than many of the people in this room. Except maybe I'm from Brooklyn, New York, and I have a bigger mouth. Now, I would like to extend my appreciation very deeply to Kimi Sato, who, when I first met her in 2002, I was very impressed by her strength and her obvious knowledge and commitment to improving her life and the lives of disabled people in Sapporo and in Japan. I'd also like to thank Masaki Okamoto and all the staff of the center for the great work that they're doing. Who is from the U.S. Embassy, my friend said speaks perfect Japanese, and Shinji Hosokawa, who is also with the consulate here, and John Taylor for the wonderful support they've given me in arranging to come to Sapporo. In celebrating the 15th anniversary of the Sapporo Center for Independent Living, we're really celebrating not only the work of the center, but the work of the community and the support that the government is giving to the center. Today is a Sunday, and there are many people who have come, not only to hear from me, but to also listen to the other speakers and to be able to ask questions which will help advance the work going on in Sapporo. I started to visit Japan in 1983 when the independent living movement was just emerging in the United States and was beginning to emerge in Japan. This was a very exciting time for many reasons. One, because this was really the first international exchange between the Japanese disability community and the United States disability community, coming together to learn from each other and to be supportive of our objectives, removing the barriers that were excluding us from our societies because of prejudice and because the disability community itself at that point was not empowered enough. In many ways, our two countries have grown up side by side, developing a strong disability rights movement. So the story that I'm going to tell you now is very similar to other stories that other people in the room could be telling. So I am 64 years old, and I was born in 1947 in Philadelphia, but moved to Brooklyn, New York 3 months later. I had polio in 1949, so I was the first of 3 children born to my parents, who were immigrants to the United States. Like for many families, when a child becomes disabled, it's not something that you expect. And so for my parents, it was a very new experience. And they really had to become knowledgeable about what it meant to have polio and what responsibilities they would now have as my parents. In 1949 in the United States, we had no civil rights legislation for disabled people, or for that matter, any other groups of people in our society. Civil rights laws did not start becoming a part of the structure of our country till the 1960s. So my parents were dealing with me being in and out of the hospital for about 2 years, and my mother had her second child, so there were now 2 of us, and they were very busy with the new business and also helping me become rehabilitated. My parents had decided that even though I had a disability, they had the same expectations for me as they did for my brother. They expected me to go to school, to learn, to study, and to be able to advance in life. So when I was 5 years old, my mother took me to the local school to enroll me in school. But the principal said that I was not allowed to go to that school because I was in a wheelchair. So my parents, who were really not advocates at that time, they were like any other family in the United States, raising children, working, going about their day-to-day lives, learned that they were going to have to be able to learn how to become an advocate for me, because the expectations that the society had for what I was going to be able to do were very low. Until I was 9 years old, a teacher came to my house 2.5 hours a week. Not a very good education. Then I finally started to go to school, but it was only in classes for disabled children. And the education in those classes was also not very good. My mother began to work with other parents of disabled children to demand that the education ministry in New York City make high schools accessible so that those of us who use wheelchairs would be able to go to the regular high schools. So I finally started to go to school with non-disabled children when I was in high school in 1961. And that was a very important period in my life. When I finally started to go to school with non-disabled children, I was also learning about the real demands of education, having to study hard in order to be able to get good grades, in order to be able to go to the university. Finally, I began to see that I did have a future, and that it was going to be my responsibility to really take hold of my future. But at that time also, as a disabled person, I was a teenager, and I wanted to start doing things like my other friends who were teenagers were doing, going out more independently, using the buses, using the trains, socializing. But because of all the barriers that existed, socializing was very difficult, because I was still very restricted because of the barriers within society. It was around that time that my friends who had disabilities and I started to really think about and dream about what world we wanted to create. We wanted to create a world where those of us who had disabilities, whether it was a physical disability or a sensory disability, if you were blind or deaf or had an intellectual disability, and if you were young or old, you shouldn't be discriminated against based on one's disability. There were no ramps on the streets, so if you were in a wheelchair, it was very difficult to get across the street. The buses were not accessible, the subways were not accessible, many of the stores were not accessible, there were bathrooms that were not wheelchair accessible. Every place you went, there were invisible signs that said, disabled people not welcome. So as teenagers, we began to think about how we wanted to create the world. And then in 1965, when I started to go to university, there were many disabled people at universities around the United States who were also dreaming the same dream of making the country better for everyone. We were also being inspired by the civil rights movements in the 1960s, Dr. Martin Luther King and the movement that he was leading, and the movement that women were developing, and at that time the anti-war movement. So we were seeing on television and reading in the newspaper, and friends were becoming activists. And as disabled people, we started to see that we too needed to become activists. We needed to find our own voice, and we needed to begin to be more public and demanding about the changes that we wanted to see happen. I wanted to be a teacher. I had always wanted to be a teacher. But there were no teachers in New York City who were using wheelchairs. So I decided that I would study to be a teacher. And when I graduated from the university, I applied for a teaching position. So I applied to become a teacher, and in New York we had to take 3 exams: a written exam, an oral exam, and a medical exam. Each one of those exams were given in buildings that were completely inaccessible. They each had 1 to 2 flights of steps, and so my friends carried me up the stairs so I could take each one of these exams. I passed my written exam, I passed my oral exam, and I was failed on the medical exam because I couldn't walk. That was the official reason that I was denied my job. So I was able to get 2 attorneys, 2 lawyers to represent me, and I sued the Board of Education. There was a lot of coverage in the newspaper and on television. The New York Times wrote an editorial called Human versus the Board of Education, and then all the major papers in New York did editorials supporting my getting a position. And finally, the Board of Education was told by the judge in the court that she wanted them to give me another medical exam because she thought that my denial as a teacher was wrong. So I finally got my teaching license, and then I was a teacher for 3 years in the public schools, elementary school in New York City. But what I was realizing with my other friends with disabilities is that we really needed civil rights legislation for disabled people. And we set up an organization called Disabled in Action, which was an organization run by disabled people with different types of disabilities. And our goal was to help change laws to give rights to disabled people. Between 1973 and now 2012, we have seen many major changes in laws in the United States to advance the civil rights and human rights of people with all types of disabilities and of all ages. In 1973, the first major piece of civil rights legislation was passed in the United States, protecting the rights of disabled people. The law says, if you are getting money from the federal government, you may not discriminate against a person based on their disability. This law meant that public schools could no longer deny children the right to an education. It meant that hospitals and universities had to make themselves accessible. It meant that state governments, county governments, city governments that were receiving money from the federal government all had to end practices of discrimination in employment and in services. So in the 1960s, we were seeing the development of disabled students programs on college campuses. And then in 1972, we saw the creation of the first Center for Independent Living in Berkeley, California. I moved from New York to California to become a part of the development of the Center for Independent Living, which is a community-based organization like the Sapporo CIL that basically is working for the empowerment of disabled people, works very closely with city government, our county government, state government, and federal government to demand changes for the quality of life for disabled people. Today we have more than 500 centers for independent living in the United States, and those organizations have played a very critical role not only in helping disabled people find their voices at the community level, but have been very, very instrumental in the implementation of Section 504, the first civil rights law, and then became very involved in the development and passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. Personal assistance services like the center in Sapporo, Help Support, is a very important part of the work of the centers in the United States, but also activism for implementation of our civil rights laws is another very critical part of the work of the centers. I would say that it would be good for Japan and the US to work together on learning about how the laws in the United States have really helped to make advancements for disabled people in our country. When I look at the United States over the last 64 years, I see tremendous changes, not only in the physical environment, but the laws that we have, which make it illegal to discriminate, also have resulted in federal and state governmental agencies having to take responsibility for implementation of these laws. So if a disabled person believes they have been discriminated against, they can file a complaint with the federal government, and in some cases the state government, and then the government investigates. Those investigations are very important because they have resulted in many important court decisions and government decisions supporting the right for disabled people to live in the community, to go to school in the community, and to work in the community. So I'd like to thank you for listening to a little bit of my story, and I look forward to the rest of the afternoon. Arigato.
今回の講演会では、日本の自立生活運動に携わる女性リーダーたちによるパネルディスカッションが行われ、日米における自立生活運動について活発な情報交換、意見交換が行われました。障害を持つ当事者はどのようにして自らの障害と向き合い、障害を自分の個性として認め、元気や力を取り戻してきたのか、そして社会変革へとつなげてきたのか、パワフルな皆さんのメッセージをお楽しみください。
皆さんこんにちは。これからパネルディスカッションに入っていきたいと思います。今日のコーディネーターをさせていただきます樋口恵子と言います。よろしくお願いします。私、樋口恵子の自己紹介です。私は本当に30年ぐらいジュディと知り合っているなっていうのを、知り合ってから30年がもう過ぎてしまったなって思い起こしているんですけれど、81年の6月に私にとっては初めての海外旅行、バークレーの自立生活センターを学びに行きたいということで行ったんですね。でバークレーの CIL の中で、CIL の説明をしてくださった方は別の方で、みんながバークレー大学を見に行こうと言って出かけた時に、私が出遅れてセンターの前でうろうろしてると、そこへジュディが通りかかり、日本に早く呼んでよっていう感じで呼びかけられて、それが83年に実現したバークレーのバークレーでアメリカから自立生活運動をその日本に紹介する何か所か、全部6カ所ですかでやった つながりになっていくんですけど、私自身は84年の11月から前はミスタードーナツのスポンサーでと言いました。今はダスキン、アイノア財団と言ってますがスポンサーで海外で障害を持った人たちがリーダーシップを学ぶという機会を与えられまして、バクレーに6ヶ月滞在して自立生活センターや知的障害の人たちの活動、ピープルファーストとか、それからローセンロースでいろんな知的な人たちのグループ活動をしている団体とかで学ばせてもらいました。そして86年に帰国しまして、それでヒューマンケア協会、日本で初めての自立生活センターと言われているヒューマンケア協会の立ち上げに加わりまして、そして89年3年後に地元町田で町田ヒューマンネットワークという自立生活センターを立ち上げて、全国にピアカウンセリングや、それから障害を持った人が自分たちの思いで生きてっていいよって、自分たちがどうしたいかがまず最初なんだよっていうことを伝えていくような活動をしてきました。そして90年には全国の自立生活センター協議会という全国的なつながりを立ち上げて、ということで自立生活運動という中にどっぷりと入って30年近くを生きてきたという感じです。でもう年も取ってきたし疲れてきた。
東京の日野市にあります、自立生活センターというので事務局長をしています秋山清子です。よろしくお願いします。私の障害というのは、病気で進行性の筋疾患で徐々に筋肉の力が衰えていくというのが障害なんですけれども、小中高、大の途中ぐらいの大学生の途中ぐらいまではいわゆる健常者として、生活をしてきました。ですので障害を持って生活をするというのは本当に私の中、身近には多少同級生にはいましたけれども、私とはやはり関係のない世界という形でずっと生きてきました。そうした中で大学4年になって、ちょっと病気が進んできて、実際に初めてそこで、私自身の病気と向き合うことになり、本当は大学を卒業して仕事をして社会に出ていきたいと、親から早く旅立ちたい、育ちたいと思ったところに逆に親の手を借りないと生きられない障害ということになっていきました。樋口さんが立てた、ヒューマンケア協会なんですけれども、そこへ行った時に私自身、全く将来の夢を持たないでいて、将来どうしたもんかと、こうやって生きていくのもどうしたらいいのかという時に、あなたが自分がやりたいと思ったらここはそれを手伝うよと。何をしたいか、分からなかったらこれから少しずつ外へ出ていっていろんな経験をして、それで自分のやりたいことを見つけたらどうですかって言われたんです。でそこですごく自分がそれまで思っていたのと違う世界っていうのを見せてもらいました。そうした中で私自身も家族から離れて24時間の介護で今生活しているんですけれども、それまで何の価値もないと思っていた自分自身が私にももしかしたら何かできることがあるかもしれないという思いでこの自立生活運動に入ることになりました。で実際にじゃあ私の役割って何だろうと思った時に、私自身が何も価値がないと思っていたところから、本当に180度ガラッと人生が変わることになったわけですけど、ちょっとしたきっかけ、また社会のいろんな情報をきちっと知っていくことで一人一人の気持ち、また社会が変わるんだということを私自身がかなり実感したんですね。なのでそれをみんなに知ってもらえればいいかなと思って今この活動をしています。国内だけではなくて、今現在は海外に自立生活センターを作るという活動も、一緒にやっています。 で本当に私自身は日本の恵まれた環境の中で自立生活をスタートすることができました。もちろん運動も一緒にしていますけれども、例えばアジアに行くと、まだまだ本当に何の手当もなく、何の行政からの補助もなく、厳しい環境の中で、何十年も寝たきり状態で生活している。でそうした人たちがそうじゃなくて違う生活があるよということを少し知っていくことで、また新しく活動していくということを、お手伝いさせていただいているんですけれども、そうした活動の中でいろんなどこの国に行っても生きられる社会っていうのが、私にとって、とても生きがいのある活動に今現在なっています。簡単ですが、私の自己紹介をこれで終わりにしたいと思います。
皆様こんにちは。私は北昇大学の人間福祉学部で働いております梶晴美と申します。私は埼玉の出身なんですけれども、1980年代にですね、10年間ぐらい、看護師をしておりました。で最初は総合病院だったんですけれども、次に行った病院が障害者のリハビリテーションセンターの病院でした。で自立生活運動というところとは、その頃は全く無縁だったわけですけれども、北海道へ来てですね、今来てから約20年ぐらいになるんですけれども、で大学に入ってからその自立生活運動というところにちょっと知ることになったわけです。で今の職場、大学教員という形で、職に就いてから、障害のある方の問題について、いろいろ、勉強させてもらうようになって、自立生活運動、あるいはその自立生活センターの方々と、関わらせていただくことになりました。最初はですね、私の関心は介助ということを、元が看護師で看護をやっていたということもあって、介助ということがやはり私の頭の中にはあったわけで、実践登録ヘルパーというね、そういう制度が以前あったんですけれども、そのことが知りたくてですね、全国の自立生活センターに調査をお願いしたりして、そのことでジルに怒られたりもしましたけれども、そして、全国というと東京とか奈良とかそれからいわき市の被災したいわきのですね自立生活センターのところにもちょっと訪ね歩いたりもしてきました。で道内の自立生活センター、数カ所ありますけれども、そちらにも伺って、その介助についてお話を当事者の方からのお話を伺ったりとかも、したりしてでおりました。ですから私はその重度障害者の介助ということを、調べていくうちに、CIL 自立生活センターと出会うことができて、でその中で、抱えている CIL の抱えている問題であるとか、あるいはその障害のある方自身がどのように生活を望んでいるのか、何を求めているのかというようなことを、知ることができました。でまた今大学で教えているという立場から、学生にはですねできるだけその当事者の方の声を聞かせてあげたいと思って、何名かの方に岡本さんにも来ていただきましたけれども、大学に来ていただいて学生に直接話していただくということを今はしております。なることですが簡単ですけれども、
佐藤絹代です。臨時で研修者ネットワークと、CIL 札幌の代表をしております。私は、人工呼吸器をつけて てもう40年近くなるんですけれども、病名は進行性脊髄性筋萎縮症ということで、背骨が、変形することで重機で呼吸がしづらい、肺が圧迫されて重機で呼吸がしづらいという障害を持っています。で、人工呼吸器をつけています。で、私がですね、自主生活運動と出会ったきっかけはですね、12歳の時にベンチレーターをつけまして、その時にですね、もう一生病院からも出られないだろうというふうに言われました。で、人工呼吸器をつけるということはそういうことなので、将来に夢を持ってはいけないし、希望を持ってはいけない、病院の中だけで楽しめるような、ことを見つけなさいというふうに、お医者さんの方から、言われたのが、15歳ぐらいの時だったと思います。で、同年代の仲間たちがみんな高校に進学したりとかですね、いろんな学校に行ったり、自分の将来というものをですね、考える時にですね、私はあなたはもう一生病院だよというふうに言われて、すごく絶望した気持ちになってですね、施設の中でですね、暗い青春時代を送ってたんですね。で、寝たきりの状態が随分長く続いていまして、施設の中で昔はポータブルの人工呼吸器がなかったですから、ずっとですね、寝たきりで病室から一歩も出られずに、いつも窓の外を手鏡で見ながらですね、とても外の世界に憧れて、一生病院の中で生きるのはあまりにも辛いし嫌だなというふうに思っていて、なんとか外の世界に出られないものかというふうに思っていたのが10代の頃です。で、その後ですね、自立生活運動との出会いというのがあるんですが、もう20年以上前にですね、札幌の上会が主催されました。その時に樋口さんもいらっしゃったんですけれども、ケアカウンセリングというですね、もう25年くらい前ですね、講座があって、それに出た時にですね、講座に出た時に初めて同じ障害を持つそのカウンセラーの方がですね、私が病院を出て自立をしたいと思っているんだけれど、みんな呼吸器をつけて自立なんてできるはずがない、呼吸器を外すしかないんだ、だから外すリハビリをしようというふうにしか言われず、とてもハードなリハビリをしていると。で、呼吸器をつけながら病院から外に出るなんてありえないと言われているんだけど、私はどうしても外の世界で生きていきたいというふうに言った時に、そのカウンセラーの骨形性不全というですね、障害を持った彼女がですね、私をまっすぐに見つめて、あなたには絶対できる、障害は個性だよ、ありのままの自分を愛して生きていいんだっていうふうに言ってくれたんですね。で、その時に本当に初めて障害は個性っていう言葉に出会ったっていうことと、それから靴下を1時間かけて自分で履くよりも、人生にはもっともっと大事なことがあるっていうふうに教えてくれたんですね。で、それはすごく目から鱗というか、衝撃的な自立生活運動との出会いでした。で、今自立生活センターのお仕事をしながら子育てをしています。子育て真っ最中なんですけれど、子育てを楽しみながら今自立生活センターのお仕事をさせていただいています。人工呼吸器をつけたら一生病院から出られないとか、呼吸器をつけたら声が出なくなるとかですね、呼吸器をつけたらもう人生終わりなんだみたいなですね、ことが今でもやっぱり言われている社会なんですけれども、そうじゃないよって、人工呼吸器っていうのが、私たちにとってはメガネや車椅子と同じ生活の道具なんだよっていうことをですね、多くの人に知っていただきたい。そして、人生を豊かにするためのパートナーなんだよっていうことをですね、たくさんの方たちにメッセージをし していきたくて活動をしています。よろしくお願いいたします。
はい、ありがとうございました。で、これから、ジュディさんに寄せられている質問を読ませていただき、そしてジュディから答えていただきたいと思います。
My mother's message, my mother and father's message to me was that I needed to work hard and they were not going to treat me any differently than my brothers. They clearly were also very supportive of the work that I was doing when I sued the Board of Education and when I helped set up Disabled in Action, and when I was involved in many other political activities. My mother and father would come to many of the meetings, and my mother would take notes and type them up, and they were very supportive of everything that we were doing. I believe that meetings like today are important for helping people who work for government to get a better understanding of what we as disabled people, how we want to live our lives. And so that you can see yourselves as a support, as an agent, but not as a person who will take control over what our interests and desires are. I believe that, I think part of the question had to do with parents having to protect their children. And my feeling is that it's important for disabled children to be a part of the general society and to teach other children right from wrong. So in the United States, we have an active anti-bullying program that is not just directed at stopping non-disabled children from bullying disabled children, but really helping to address the whole problem of a lack of acceptance of people who are different. And so, for me, being a part of society makes us have to address the problems that we face. Having disabled children separated from the general society, in my view, only makes the problem worse. And I believe the last comment had to do with personal assistants not being allowed to assist people on the job or to assist people in schools. This makes no sense. I have two people who work for me on my job. They assist me with personal assistance needs. They do much more than that in the job. And we have people who work with students in primary school, high school, universities. It would be illegal not to allow that to happen. Who pays is a separate question, but not allowing that support in the States would not be legal. So I think that someone who is deaf can have an interpreter on the job, and someone who is blind can have someone as a reader. So there should be nothing different for someone who needs a personal assistant than for someone who needs a reader or a sign language interpreter, or for someone who has an intellectual disability and may need job coaching on the job. Those are all tasks that enable people to do their jobs. So I think part of the problem is, in the United States and in Japan, people don't like to think about somebody who needs help going to the bathroom. And I think that there's a real big taboo about that issue. And it's a reality that everybody does that. Some people need assistance to do that. But the denial of being able to get that support on the job means people who are able to work can't work. Or what you see frequently is people with disabilities getting health problems because they can't go to the bathroom in school, or they can't go to the bathroom on the job. It's completely not normal. Probably in Japan, the whole human rights and civil rights movement itself is still developing. Women's rights and elder rights and rights of minorities are probably still evolving. So if that in fact is true, then I think what's very important is that disabled people are working with other movements in Japan to try to create human rights and civil rights laws with protections. Not only can you not discriminate, but with clear language about what discrimination is and what the responsibility is of government to ensure that if someone proves discrimination, that the government takes action against that illegal or that violation, legal violation. In the United States, the disability laws came after the civil rights laws on race and sex and age. But that was because we didn't have a disability movement at that point. And we weren't working collaboratively with those other movements. But today, it's different. And today there's much more collaboration across the different human rights and civil rights organizations. So there's been a very dramatic change. And I really do think that having people work together to develop legislation is much more powerful because there are many more people when you work as a group. And some of the rules that you may need to define what discrimination against a disabled person in the area of employment may look like might be different than discrimination in the area of race or sex, because we can get into a longer discussion about it, but there would be some additional things. But conceptually, the issue that you're trying to address is government's responsibility to ensure that the rights of people are protected. And that's really what the overall perspective, in my view, should be.
はい、ありがとうございます。米国では障害者のことは人権の問題として取り扱っていく。で、日本は何かっていうと何でしょう、皆さん。障害者の問題っていうと、福祉サービスにこだわっていくんですね。だから制度は日本の今の経済的レベルがこうだから福祉のレベルもここまでというような決まり方をして、それが一人一人の障害者にこう配られていくというような感じで、そこに障害者の権利とか人権という意識が極めて薄いっていうのが日本とアメリカの大きな違いなのかなっていうふうに整理すると割合分かりやすく、これからの社会はそれこそ2002年10年前の2002年 DPI 札幌世界会議ではそれぞれの国で差別禁止法を成立させようっていうのと、それから国連の障害者権利条約をしっかり制定して基準をしていこうっていうコミットメントをしてみんな世界に帰っていったっていうか、それぞれの国に帰っていったわけですよね。で、国連では2006年ですか、権利条約が成立して、そして韓国とかでは差別禁止法ができてっていう近くの国々でもいろんな動きになっているけど、まだ一歩日本は、基準はまだする前の国内法の整備を一生懸命今やっているところ 差別禁止法は来年法制化するというスケジュールで動いているっていう段階なので、ジュディがおっしゃるように、やっぱり日本は権利についての意識がまだまだ幼いっていうところではないかというふうに思います。
やっぱり自分たちが声を上げているっていうことがとても大事だし、自分たちがそのお店にせっせと通うっていうのもいいかなと思うんですけど、私がまだ20年自立生活したばっかりの頃にとても美味しいパスタ屋さんがあって、そこのイタリアンレストランにせっせと通ってたんですが、そこがやっぱり10センチぐらいの段差が2段ぐらいあって、でそこの2段ぐらいの段差をいつも友人たちが担いでですね、私を連れて行ってくれたりしたんですけれども、1年ぐらい通い続けてたらスロープがついたんですね。ですごいと思って、それでとっても嬉しくて、でその時のこんな風に車椅子の人もこのお店に来るんだよ、ここの、ね、パスタが欲しいからせっせと通っていますみたいな感じでこう通い続けていると、やっぱり自然の理解が深まっていくのかなっていう気がしたんですね。もちろん声を上げて社会をバリアフリーにしようとかいうのもものすごく大事なんですけれども、なんか自分の生活の中からそうやって身近に好きなお店に通い続けると、いつの間にかスロープがついているとかね、そういうふうに身近な人たちがこう理解を示していってくれるっていう輪をどんどん広げていくっていうことがね、とても大事なのかなって思います。
I completely agree that we need to spend our money in the community so that merchants see that we're the same as anybody else. We have money, whatever the color of the money and for the country is. But I believe it's very important that we have laws and rules which make it clear about what is required. Because we shouldn't have to wait for the goodwill of somebody to make these kinds of changes. And I think that when you get a good law passed, which has good rules explaining what to do in the area of accessibility, it also makes it easier for the merchant to know what they have to do. And I think that's also important. People may want to make a change, they don't know how to do it. They may want to build a ramp, but maybe they make it too steep and it needs to be less steep. So I'm a very firm believer that in these areas we need laws and good rules. First of all, I think one difference between the Centers for Independent Living in Japan and the Centers for Independent Living in the United States and Europe is that we are cross-disability organizations. So our centers are run by people who are blind and deaf and have physical disabilities. They're not one disability focused. And that, I think, has also been very helpful to enable us to work together and to learn about our differences and to learn about our common objectives. So people with autism and intellectual disabilities and traumatic brain injuries and deafness and blindness and all kinds of physical disabilities by law, because our federal legislation in the area of independent living, if you receive money from the federal government to operate a Center for Independent Living, you have to be a cross-disability advocacy organization. And I think that has been very helpful. I also believe that it is important for the disability community to work together in order to be able to get the kind of legislation that you want next year, the civil rights legislation. In the United States, certainly for the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act we had to learn to work together, and we had to learn to compromise, and to understand that the biggest issue we were working on addressing was discrimination, and then we had to look at how we would want our law written to be able to be equitable across all the disability groups. So I think it would be worth it. I know many people have, but I think it would really be worth it to also look at the Americans with Disabilities Act from the eye of cross-disability. I have a story to tell you about women in the independent living movement. So you have an organization called JCIL, Japanese Japanese Council on Independent Living Centers. So our organization started it's 30 years ago, 1982. And we realized that there had not been a president elected who was a woman from the center movement. So the women who were involved with NCIL organized together, so we got the first woman elected to be the chairperson of NCIL in the later 80s. I think the disabled women in the US, like here in Japan, also see the need to work together and to provide each other strength, as I think we see internationally with the CRPD, the special language in there on rights of disabled women. And I also agree that we need to be supporting the youth, disabled youth, to get them involved in the movement. And we have, both in my job now doing international work, for example, the embassy is working on a program supporting youth. And I've been talking to the staff about including disabled youth in the program, because that's another way to ensure that we get we get youth with and without disabilities together to work together to see that they're part of the same community.
20年経ってですね、少しずつその当たり前のことがですね、さあチャレンジしようっていうふうに言わなくてもですね、できるようになってきてるのかなって、そしてチャレンジしなくても当たり前に暮らしていける社会になっていけたらどんなにいいだろうというふうに願っています。で、まだまだですね、差別もあるし、待ちつけたら嫌な思いをしたりとか、こう辛いことがあったりとかっていうこともたくさんありますけれども、それでもやっぱりこう痛みをパワーに変えてじゃないですけれども、これからもいろんな自分の中でのね、体験をパワーに変えて社会を変えていけたらいいなというふうに思っています。
I'd like to say it's such an honor to be here, and I'd like to thank Kimmy so much for inviting me. Kimmy for inviting me here today, and for the privilege of being on this panel. And I'd also like to thank Masako Okihira, who has gotten us here to Japan, and we'll be going to Tokyo on Tuesday. And I would also like to say that I think what's happening in Japan and around the world is, as disabled people become activists and successfully make changes in our communities, other people see that they're benefiting from the changes that we have said are important. And in Japan, with the growing population of elderly people, I think much of the work that the disability community has been doing to make the society physically accessible and to be able to have services like personal assistance services, I think are something that universally people are benefiting from. So I think we're at a point in time now where we understand the importance of working together and listening to each other and collaborating, because our efforts, which frequently people thought were not appropriate and shouldn't be implemented, have really bettered societies here and around the world. So thank you for this opportunity.
これからも札幌 CIU 札幌15周年目の節目を超えて、また地道に活動していかれると思いますので、ぜひ皆さん応援してあげてください。今日は本当にありがとうございました。
2006年12月に国連において障害者差別禁止条約が採択されました。これを受け、日本をはじめ各国が批准に向けて取り組みが行われています。どんなに重い障害を持っていても、必要なサポートや障害を持つ人に対する理解が深まることで、地域で安心して自立生活を送ることができます。私たちはアメリカの ADA 法のような差別禁止法の制定、障害者の自立生活が自らのリーダーシップによって実現できる社会づくりを目指し、運動を続けていきます。